calculated. Welcome to the I'm a Busy Guy show. My name is Vince LoCascio, and I'm a busy guy. Fortunately, I've worked this into my schedule today. I'd like to welcome my guests, Rob Gurka and J.J. Allen from Perry's Music.
Hi, Vince. How you doing?
Nice to have you here. Well, we've got a lot to talk about. We're going to talk about the history of guitars and a little bit about Perry's Music. So let's flash back and see who gets, you tell me who gets the history for the credit of inventing the guitars. I've heard the Egyptians, the Greeks.
Sure. Well, the history of stringed instruments probably goes back, as far back as the Egyptians. Somebody probably came up with the idea of taking a string and putting it on either a box or some type of thing that would resonate. And it probably slowly developed over the years, but guitar in its present form was a descendant of the lute, which was very popular during the Renaissance time. And a lute was an instrument that had what they called choruses of strings. There would be like pairs of two at a time, which eventually developed into the modern 12-string guitar. But the original lutes had pairs of strings, and in the 1800s...
And how many pairs?
I think they had what they called either 6 choruses of strings, which would have been the equivalent of about 12 strings, but in pairs. And then in the 1800s, the guitar kind of took its present form in Europe, especially Spain. A guy by the name of Torres was generally considered the father of the modern guitar. Now back then, this was before the advent of steel strings. So guitars kind of developed from the lute with 6 choruses of 2 strings each to 6 regular strings, which at that time were made out of catgut from animals because they didn't have any modern techniques for steel strings. Was that what
nylon strings evolved from?
Absolutely.
On a classical guitar that we use?
Absolutely. And the nylon strings, they're made out of a different material, or the catgut. It's kind of a softer material that had more of a mellower tone. And then a lot of the writers back at that time would take famous classical pieces from Bach and different people and convert them into arrangements for the guitar. So Spanish guitars developed with classical music, then eventually into people like Andrea Segovia, to say nothing of the gypsy bands and all that stuff going on with the more common people as a common instrument that people would play for fun.
Okay, and then to flash forward a little bit, but in America, I would believe the first appearances it started to have was with the Gene Autry, the Cowboys, singing cowboys.
Sure. Well, guitars had come into America with a lot of the slave trade and different things like that from different countries. But a lot of people don't realize that during the early 1900s, from about 1900 to almost 1930, actually the mandolin and the banjo were extremely popular instruments. There would be whole orchestras of 20, 30 people, both men and women, playing mandolins and banjos in unison. And they would do parades and social events and all that. It wasn't until probably the early 30s, after the advent of first motion pictures and then motion pictures with sound, where stars like Gene Autry, who not only could act in probably was originally silent movies, the Western became a very popular thing, and then as he was also a performer and a singer and a songwriter, the Gene Autry was one of the first singing cowboys to make the guitar very popular in the 30s, and that's probably when the guitar really took off.
Yeah, I didn't realize there was such a thing for cowboy guitars until I started researching for today's show. I mean, there's a museum of cowboy guitars, and they all had all the designs painted on there. Something I wanted to mention, because you mentioned about groups of orchestras of guitars, along the way to other things I saw on YouTube, it was like the world records of the most guitars being played at the same time. And it was interesting to see what countries it in. First off, they were playing the song Hey Joe all together, and it was in Poland. I mean,
wow.
It just, I thought when I first saw it was going to be, here or somewhere, but it was great to see that many people, especially playing that song at the same time. Okay, so then we move ahead from Gene Autry. Now we've got Elvis, but even with Elvis, the guitars, he held one, but it was all about him. The guitars were kind of in the background then. So then where do we go from there?
Well, I think Elvis, even though he wasn't so-called the main player, brought popularity to the guitar. He really did. I mean, even though he strummed a few chords and got up there, it was still in the main focus. And so although the main guitar player, who's in the background, Elvis brought some popularity to the guitar, and that's one reason I picked it up.
Okay.
That's why I play today, because I thought that was very cool, and that's what I wanted to do. So it was, even though it wasn't out front to speak of, it made a major impact on kids like me at the time.
And he was, I mean, shame on me to say, but he was quite the guitar player, because on that the NBC special that he really plays quite a bit.
Absolutely, he was very underrated. I mean, you wouldn't say that was his forte, definitely the singing and performing, but he was definitely a competent guitar player, especially for his time.
So then, just a little controversy, but how would you compare acoustic to electric, and how did electric guitars evolve?
Well, actually, electric guitars, during the 30s, with the advent of the big band music became very popular, and being that you'd have a drummer with a bass player and a number of horn instruments in that, the guitar was more of a rhythm instrument at that time. It just kind of carried the rhythm in the background. But there were so many other instruments that you could barely hear the guitar. So what had happened is, first they developed this thing called the resonator guitar. Actually, some brothers that were originally out of Chicago, the DePera brothers, invented a guitar that was kind of similar to a regular acoustical guitar.
I think I could show a picture of that.
Yeah, there you go. Except it had a metal resonator with a cone in it, and inside the guitar there was actually a wooden ring where the outer circle of that metal resonator goes. It was like a tone chamber. And you notice there's a couple holes on the top. The strings would vibrate, causing the cone to vibrate also, and it would make the guitar be almost like a loudspeaker or a horn, and would project the sound out the front. And it was the first attempt to make a guitar louder. But as things will go, it wasn't loud enough. That's a very common phrase nowadays.
Look where we're at now.
And kids, it's never loud enough. Okay, I've been there myself. But in the late 30s, a very popular jazz player by the name of Charlie Christian worked with a company called Gibson, and they were one of the first ones to develop a practical pickup for electric guitar. So the electric guitar really kind of came into being in the mid-30s with Rickenbacker, had a thing called the frying pan. Back then, Hawaiian music was also very popular. And the frying pan literally looked like a frying pan with strings on it, and they would play it with a metal bar. If you ever hear Hawaiian music, it's got a tone that'll kind of, almost like a singing tone, okay? So the Rickenbacker frying pan was one of the first electric guitars with Hawaiian music. Then it developed more into the jazz style of guitars in the late 30s, which were very popular with the big bands, especially the big bands in the 40s. And that kind of carried on from there.
Well, and then speaking of Hawaiian music, where does the ukulele fit into all this?
Actually, from what I understand, the ukulele has been a popular national instrument in Hawaii probably from the late 1800s. And it's funny you mentioned the ukulele. It's come into a hugely popular thing nowadays.
McCartney loves playing his
ukulele. Oh, absolutely. A lot of people don't know it, but George Harrison was one of the first ones to introduce the rest of the Beatles into playing ukulele. And I believe at George's funeral, I believe Paul McCartney got up and played something on the ukulele.
Something maybe he started off with. Let's not forget Tiny Tim either, right?
Tiny Tim,
absolutely.
who was also very underrated. I had the pleasure to see Tiny Tim back in probably the late 60s, early 70s. And even though he had his big hit with Tiptoe Through the Tulips, a lot of people don't realize that he was a very, very competent opera singer.
Is that right?
And he put on a whole show where he did everything from that high falsetto voice to very deep, powerful singing, and it was quite a show.
No kidding. Boy,
it's
nice to hear him get credit. Everybody thought it was just Tiptoe Through the Tulips.
Oh, yeah.
So now we take us to folk music, the guitars.
Sure. Well, during the 50s, the beatnik generation came around, okay? A lot of bohemians were known for their, kind of stretching the envelope with their ideas and about society and art and everything else, and some of them would be playing this folk music, which was basically just an evolution of music from the people. It could be old gospel tunes from the 1900s or slave tunes that the natives brought over from Africa, but But during the late 1950s, the folk boom kind of developed with people like Joan Baez, Judy Collins, Bob Dylan, and this was almost a precursor to the rock and roll movement slightly thereafter. Now, early rock and roll in America, after Elvis and things like that, and Chuck Berry, a lot of it was based on early rock and roll, Bill Haley and the Comets. But at the same time, folk music with some of these artists, the Kingston Trio, had a huge amount of success in the early 60s and created a whole folk boom where the acoustical guitar became extremely popular. Then a few years later, after the Beatles came in with the British invasion, it's been, the electric guitar has really taken over. It's got thousands and millions of people playing guitar.
Yeah, well, the whole the folk guitar thing. I know I went to Catholic grammar school, and as the gig came along, with they were going to have the hootenanny mass.
Oh yeah,
You guys remember that? And all the nuns got guitars, and it was they were Sears Silvertone guitars, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But yeah, it was being instituted, and this was all happening at the same time while the Beatles and all this revolution was going on. And then tell me a little bit about Bob Dylan's big transition that caused a ruckus when he started playing electric.
Well, Bob Dylan, as you probably know, was extremely popular during the early 60s. He had come out with some tunes that Times They Are Changing, things like that. They were kind of protest tunes, but they really touched the heart of a lot of people and started a whole movement of protest and evolution in that. And he was extremely well known for his folk music. What had happened, like most artists, he was not happy just to be branded as a folk singer. He wanted to evolve. So I think it was 1963, there was this Newport Folk Festival in California, which was usually entirely acoustic music, folk music. And his band had just released, I believe it was his Highway 61 album that he had come out with the hit Like a Rolling Stone on it.
Okay.
And he introduced the electric guitar at this concert. He came out with this band of Mike Bloomfield, and he strapped on a Fender Stratocaster, and he literally got booed off the stage.
Wow.
They, a lot of stories running around about that. Pete Seeger, who was one of the popular folk singers at the time, supposedly had taken an axe and was trying to cut the power lines.
I think I did hear that.
Yes, to cut the power lines, because he was just going out of his mind. He couldn't stand that they were playing electric music at this folk festival. And
the times they are changing.
Times they are changing, absolutely. And Bob Dylan was not real pleased about all this because, he wanted to, evolve as an artist.
Yeah.
And they basically had to beg him to come back on stage, where he came on and he did one of his tunes became very popular called It's All Over Now, Baby Blue. And some people could refer to the change of evolution from his folk roots to a little bit more contemporary and updated
And he's still
electric
changing
music.
things. I mean, he's always reinventing himself.
Constantly.
Okay, now we've reached the pinnacle. The Beatles appear on Ed Sullivan. I mean, I can show you some pictures and stuff, but if you want to tell me your memories of that.
Oh boy, it's it just, talk about times they are changing. It really shook up the music world, for good and bad. A lot of parents didn't know what they were seeing. The kids were loving it. The parents were freaking out. What is going on with this? And it was really only the beginning. They started it, and then the whole style of music caught on. More and more people did it. More and more bands plugged in. They got louder, stadiums, and it grew from there.
Well, just to talk a little, I'm sorry, Rob, your memory.
I can tell you a little bit about it. I'm about 10 years older than Jim, so it was around 1964. I remember sitting on my friend's porch down the block, and we had heard that the Beatles were coming on the Ed Sullivan Show that night. And needless to say, we all watched them, and it was such an incredible thing to see these guys up there playing music. And for a guy to see all the girls yelling and screaming at these four guys with their long hair and their guitars on stage, I think got a lot of guys interested in this might be a good way to evolve.
Well, I believe it was David Crosby said anybody who said they didn't play the guitar to get girls was a liar, right?
I would say this is a very true statement.
Yeah. I remember. I'm proud of the fact that I was old enough to be able to see him, and I've told younger people what it was just it changed everything. to see them on TV, you know, to see it live, you know. There's kids, the whole generations now that are fanatics about them, and it happened, you know, 30 years ago. I don't know what it is now, 40 years. But just on the thing of guitars, just talk a little bit about some of the guitars that they used, if you want to tell me a little bit about these.
Sure. Well, that particular one there, this is called an Epiphone Casino. Being that, you know, the Beatles were from England, very few American guitarists got over there, so they were using guitars that were more available in their country. And when they went on one of their first American tours, they visited the Gibson Epiphone factory, and they both, actually all three of them, a lot of people don't know this, but George, John, and Paul McCartney picked up this guitar here called an Epiphone Casino. And they used it from, probably the early 60s through the rest of their career. As a matter of fact, John Lennon used it after the Beatles, his guitar, his Casino guitar. It's a very popular guitar because it can emulate almost any type of a tone, from an electric guitar sound to an acoustic sound. And as you know, the Beatles were very instrumental in pioneering both electric and acoustic music.
And then this was another, I guess it originally was darker, but he had it, this was one of the famous, like in Hard Day's Night, where they're playing
right,
If I Fell, songs like that.
The Gibson J160, and that was kind of unique on its own because of the pickup system that was put in it. So it was literally acoustic or electric. But the nice thing about that is, even though when it was plugged in, it still had the acoustic tonality. When you're getting on an electric guitar, the pickups tend to be a little bit thinner, and on this it was a little bit fuller. So that was a very popular thing that worked for them real well.
And I own a J Tercer.
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, Vince, something interesting you said about the color of the guitar. The original color is what they call a sunburst, like the previous guitar you showed. And the story is that John Lennon, around the time when he was doing his protests, Give Peace a Chance and things like that, in Canada, had decided to take his guitar and sand the finish off it. And that's where it came up with that natural finish in that picture, where the original one would have had a sunburst finish.
Really?
Yeah,
and
so that's just an interesting inside story.
Talk about an icon of guitars.
Yep.
Paul McCartney playing it on
the old Hofner Beatle bass.
And he still has it.
Still has it.
That's what they say. Can't go without saying that, of course, George Harrison with the Country Gentleman, and Ringo's drums. You got to give credit to Ludwig. All right, so now we made this big impact. So now we talked about garage bands start to happen, and besides all the manufacturers that are already in the business before that, now everybody gets in the game. So now you've got what, Sears making Silvertone.
Silvertones, right?
Montgomery Ward's making airline guitars. Tyco Del Rey. Is there anything you want to tell me about those? You think they were lesser quality? I mean, I know they cost less.
Right.
But
well, I can tell you a little bit. What had happened is, you know, after the extreme boom of the Beatles and things like that, the American manufacturers couldn't produce guitars fast enough. So a lot of people don't know it, but at that time, Chicago was one of the prime producers of guitars. There was two companies in Chicago. One was called Harmony, and one was called Kay. And what they did is they had big production facilities. At that time, they were making more of an entry-level guitar for professional, you know, for students, not as much for the professionals. Professionals were buying more Fender, Gibson, higher-priced guitars, but they were able to produce a lot of guitars, and this is before the import guitars coming in from Japan. So companies like Sears would have Harmony make guitars for them under their name of Silvertone that they owned, or Montgomery Ward's would have either Harmony or the K Company make guitars under the airline name, which they sold through their catalogs, which was a huge marketing thing at that time, in addition to having them into the stores. I remember as a kid back in the 60s, you could go into a Sears store and they would have a little section over there by the TVs and the radios where they'd have maybe 6 guitars hanging on a rack, and you'd always see 3 or 4 kids standing around just, you know, eyeing those guitars, you know.
I remember buying my first guitar, saved up money from a paper route or whatever, and going into like a wholesale store that sold everything from socks and clothes to guitars and radios, and asking the lady, you know, I had the $12 saved up, and I said, you know, I want that guitar. And she said, well, are you going to play blues or rock and roll? And I said, I don't know what I'm going to play, man. You know, I said, I don't know how to play yet. But
Yeah.
everybody and anybody that you know saw the Beatles on TV wanted to play guitars.
My first electric was a Tiesco that was purchased at Walgreens.
Really?
It was at Walgreens. I think, well, I'm not quite sure of the year. It was probably late 60s. And I believe the price of the guitar at the time was like $39.95. And with the amplifier, it was $69.95. Wow. So
unbelievable. And there were what? Two, not that I know a lot about, but those were tube amplifiers at the time, right? Everything's.
Well, it could, the original Silvertones were. I think the Tiesco amp was actually first of the early solid state amplifiers to be made out of transistor.
So then what's going on? Then the people that are already in the business of making quality guitars, with the demand of all these bands, and obviously not just garage bands, but really professional good bands, their market exploded as well.
Mm-hmm.
Well, like I was saying, you know, the big companies like Fender and Gibson couldn't meet the manufacturing demands. Neither could even Harmony and K Company. So what happened is they decided to start importing guitars from out of the country. Most of the European guitars at that time were either more expensive, or there again they may not have had the production capabilities. So somebody realized that the Japanese, who were coming on very strongly at that time with manufacturing, a guy by the name of Jack Westheimer, actually a local guy out of Elk Grove Village, was among the first Americans to absolutely to recognize the need and the demand for guitars. So he imported guitars from Japan. You got to remember, back in the '60s, at one time, made in Japan generally meant kind of cheap and not so good. Well, I think we all know with brands like Toyota, Sony, any other number of brands, that now Japanese-made merchandise is very good. But at that time, it really filled the pipeline until the American manufacturers could catch up. But the funny thing is as huge as the guitar boom was in the 60s, by about 1969, not too far around the time when the Beatles broke up, it kind of came to a screeching halt. There was a number of years where the guitar production had gotten so huge, and then it almost shut off like shutting off a faucet. It's really unusual.
You think because the Beatles broke up, or I mean, the music wasn't, or people bought enough guitars?
I think there were just so many things going on with our society at the time. You know, there was the protest movements going on with the riots in Chicago, and the whole thing with the integration, all that going on, that kind of reached a point there for just a little bit, probably until the shootings in Kent State, Ohio University, Kent State, I guess was called Kent
State, yeah.
Where a number of protesters were shot and killed. And
Four dead in Ohio.
Yeah, Four Dead in Ohio.
Yep.
And Neil Young wrote that song, Ohio, and it kind of kick-started, I think, the 70s into the music scene, which eventually turned into a little bit more of a still classic rock and roll. You had groups like Cream and different groups that were carrying over into the 70s after the Woodstock Festival. The Crosby, Stills and Nash, Santana, a lot of these groups that were still using electric guitars, and kind of kick-started that generation, which eventually turned into more of a singer-songwriter thing through the rest of the 70s.
Yeah, I know we're here to talk about the guitars, but that was something we didn't touch on. How that was called folk rock. I mean, I don't know what, I believe that's what Crosby, Stills was categorized as.
Right. Absolutely.
So it was the marriage of those two things. Well, tell me a little bit about the guitars that we have here in front of us. What's the first one here? Is a Martin?
Yeah, the first guitar we got there is a Martin guitar. This was a guitar that, this particular example of a Martin was made, I believe in the late 50s, possibly early 60s. It's a personal guitar for my own collection. The thing that's unique about it, if you take a look at the way it's designed, especially starting over at the peg head where there's kind of like holes in the peg head where the strings go in, this is actually very similar to the Martin guitars that were made in the early 1900s. Frederick Martin had come over to America in the mid-1800s and brought a lot of the European craftsmanship over here, and he settled in Nazareth, Pennsylvania. and he set up the Martin Company in the 1800s. And then when guitars became more popular around 1900, like I mentioned before, at first they had nylon strings. Then around 1930 they had more or less perfected the steel string, and they evolved from there. But this particular one is kind of a crossover between the earlier guitars and ones that are still very popular today. It's what they call a parlor style guitar. It's a little bit smaller body than most guitars. Guitars are very much like physics. The larger the box, the bigger the tone, the deeper the tone, and the more volume they will have. When you have a smaller guitar, you get what they call a more balanced sound between the bass strings and the treble strings. And they're very popular. There again, they're called parlor guitars because back in the late 1800s, it was very fashionable for young men and for young women to play socially in their parlors, play guitar, and that's where they kept the name ever since.
Okay, well, we've got so much to cover. You want to move on to the middle one then?
Okay, the middle one is actually a 1962 Fender Jaguar. And this guitar, along with a Fender Jazzmaster, the Stratocaster, was really a big part of the surf music that came about.
Beach Boys.
Beach Boys,
Venture.
Janet
Well, the Ventures never sang, right? But they were.
But Venture is very.
They were part of that sound, yeah.
Absolutely, very much part of the sound, and that's where a lot of these guitars came from. Because even though they're similar, the Stratocaster, the Jaguar, the Jazzmaster really have a unique tone of their own.
They're beautiful guitars, beautiful.
Yep.
Well, let's see if they really work. But before we do, let me give you guys, you can share these cannolis, box of cannolis from Angelo's.
Well, thank you.
And let's check them out. We're going to try the Seagull. We got 2 minutes left. So we'll start real quick.
Yep.
And let's see if they really work.
Goes to Rob.
Because I'm
Hey, Vince, you know, Chicago's the home of the blues, right?
That's right.
Seagull.
And so why don't we do a little bit of blues?
How about it?
You know, for musicians understand this language. They have a thing called the 12-bar blues. And I think you know what that is.
I do.
I know Jim knows what it is. Want to give it a try?
Let's try it. See what happens.
We're going to do some 12-bar blues in the key of E.
Take it away, sir.
Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Thanks for watching. We got so much to talk about. Why don't we come back next week? You guys keep playing. I gotta go to a meeting.
What you got to do?
I gotta go to a meeting. 'Cause I'm a busy guy. Go to busyguy.com. Keep playing. Maybe when I come back next week, I'll see you on the show.
Sounds good, Vince. Thanks for having us.
I got the blues.